The maid hides her pregnancy from the millionaire boss, but he finds her unconscious in the kitchen. The sound of crystal shattering against the marble floor echoed through the spacious kitchen of the Montgomery mansion. Charlotte Wilson, a 28-year-old woman with brown hair tied up in a messy bun, leaned on the granite worktop, her trembling hands seeking balance as dark dots danced across her vision. The vintage clock on the wall read 10:43 a.m., and she knew that her boss, Theodore Montgomery, would be in his executive meeting in the second-floor office. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte tried to pull herself together. Her morning nausea had become increasingly difficult to hide, especially in recent weeks. At 12 weeks pregnant, she knew she couldn't keep her secret for much longer. The black and white housekeeper's uniform, once perfectly fitted, was beginning to feel slightly tight around the waist. "Miss Wilson?" The deep, authoritative voice of Theodore Montgomery took her by surprise, making her heart leap. He was standing in a kitchen doorway, his impeccable Italian suit contrasting with the worried expression on his angular face. "Is everything all right?" Charlotte tried to straighten up, but the sudden change of position made her vision go completely dark. Her legs gave way, and the world spun in slow motion. Before she could feel the impact of the ground, strong arms wrapped around her, stopping her fall. "Charlotte," the formality in Theodore's voice disappeared, replaced by genuine concern. The scent of his expensive cologne mingled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee from the kitchen. When Charlotte regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the leather sofa in Theodore's office. The room, with its dark wood-paneled walls and shelves full of books, had always intimidated her. Now, under the intense gaze of her boss, she felt even more vulnerable. "The doctor's on his way," Theodore informed her, his controlled voice masking an emotion Charlotte couldn't identify. "It's not the first time you've been unwell this week, is it?" Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the last few weeks on her shoulders. How to explain that the man in front of her, the powerful CEO of Montgomery Real Estate, was the father of a child? How could she tell him that that single night, during the winter ball 3 months ago, had changed her life forever? The ball had been a grand event, organized to celebrate the closing of a $1 million contract. Charlotte remembered perfectly the navy blue dress that Theodore had insisted she wear, claiming that a head housekeeper should be appropriately dressed to welcome guests. Between glasses of champagne and soft music, they had approached. Theodore Montgomery, always so controlled and distant, had turned out to be a different man that evening. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, finally finding the courage to face him. The silence that followed was deafening. Theodore remained motionless, his green eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. At 38, he was known in Boston not only for his real estate empire, but also for his reputation as an uncompromising and determined man. "How long?" His voice came out hoarse, almost unrecognizable. 12 weeks. The calculation was instantaneous in his mind. The winter ball, the night when the snow fell softly outside, while inside the mansion, carefully constructed barriers crumbled. "Why didn't you tell me before?" The question came loaded with a mixture of emotions. Anger, hurt, worry. "How could I?" Charlotte sat up slowly, adjusting her uniform. "You're Theodore Montgomery. I'm just your housekeeper. The morning after the ball, you went back to being exactly as you were before, distant, professional, as if nothing had happened." Theodore ran his hands through his black hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "You're not just my housekeeper, Charlotte. You never were." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the moment. The doctor had arrived. Theodore stood up, his posture returning to its usual control, but his eyes remained different, softer, more human. "Let's take care of you first," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Then we need to talk. About everything." Charlotte nodded, watching him walk to the door. Her mind went back to that winter's night, to the moment when their eyes met during a slow song, to the soft touch of his hands on her waist, to the kiss that had changed everything. Now, 3 months later, sitting in the office that had always represented the distance between them, Charlotte realized that some barriers, once broken, could never be rebuilt. The Montgomery mansion, with its imposing walls and silent corridors, now held a secret that would change the lives of its inhabitants forever. And as the doctor entered the study, Charlotte knew that her life as the Montgomery family's housekeeper was about to take a completely different turn than she had ever imagined. The snows of the Boston winter had long since melted, but the consequences of that night were only just beginning to blossom. Like the first spring flowers in the mansion garden, stubborn and inevitable, bringing with them the promise of a new season. The makeshift consulting room in Theodore Montgomery's office became a silent battlefield between unexchanged glances and unspoken words. Dr. Marcus Bennett, a gray-haired gentleman with gentle manners, finished examining Charlotte while Theodore remained leaning against his mahogany desk, his fingers drumming unconsciously on the polished surface. "Absolute rest for the next 2 days, Miss Wilson," prescribed the doctor, putting away his instruments. "Low blood pressure combined with pregnancy requires special care. I also recommend an appointment with an obstetrician as soon as possible." Theodore stepped forward before Charlotte could protest. "I'll arrange it immediately. The best specialist in Boston." "That's not necessary, Mr. Montgomery," Charlotte tried to argue, but was silenced by a determined look from her boss. After the doctor left, the silence hung between them like a lead curtain. Theodore walked over to the window overlooking the mansion's gardens, where the last vestiges of winter still lingered in small patches of snow under the trees. His mind inevitably wandered back to the night of the ball. "I remember every detail of that night," he began, his voice low and controlled. "You were wearing a navy blue dress that I chose myself. Vanessa, my stylist, had to make last-minute adjustments." Charlotte felt her heart race. She remembered it too. The dress had a discreet neckline at the back and fell gently to her ankles. Theodore had insisted that she attend the ball not as an employee, but as a guest. "The investors were impressed by the impeccable organization," he continued, turning to face her. "But I could only observe how gracefully you conducted everything, how you smiled at the guests, how your eyes sparkled under the ballroom lights." "Please," Charlotte whispered, feeling the tears threaten to fall. "We don't need to relive this." "Yes, we do." Theodore crossed the room with firm steps, kneeling in front of her. "Because that night, when all the guests have left, when the snow began to fall harder outside, something changed between us." The touch of his hand on her cheek made Charlotte shiver. For 3 months, she had tried to forget how soft his fingers were, how gentle his touch was despite his austere appearance. "You were arranging the last glasses at the salon bar," Theodore continued, his green eyes fixed on hers. The orchestra had already left, but the sound system was still playing soft music. "I approached, offered one last glass of champagne, and I accepted," Charlotte added, her voice just a whisper, "even though I knew I shouldn't. We danced." Theodore smiled slightly, a rare gesture that completely transformed his face. "Right there, among the empty tables and the flowers you had so carefully picked." The memory was too vivid. The warmth of their close bodies, the scent of his cologne mixed with the perfume of the flowers, the soft sound of music echoing through the empty room. Theodore had guided her steps with the same precision with which he conducted his business, but there was something different about his touch, a vulnerability she had never seen before. When the music ended, he continued, "You tried to walk away, said you had to finish organizing some things. But I didn't like you. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to be guided by my heart and not by reason." Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her tears finally overcome her. "The next day, you could barely look at me. You were back to being Mr. Montgomery, distant and professional. How could I have imagined that that night meant anything more?" Theodore stood up abruptly, wiping his hands across his face in a gesture of frustration. "Because I'm an idiot, Charlotte. Because I've spent the last 10 years building walls around myself, convincing myself that relationships were a distraction from business. And then you came along, with your quiet competence and gentle smile, breaking down every one of my defenses. And now?" Charlotte asked, her hand unconsciously resting on her still flat belly. "Now," Theodore took a deep breath, "now we need to think about the future. Not just yours or mine, but this child's future. Our child." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both quickly pull themselves together. Mrs. Henderson, the cook, knocks softly on the door before entering. "Excuse me, Mr. Montgomery. Lunch is served, and the developer's representatives have arrived for the 2 o'clock meeting." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Theodore replied, resuming his professional posture. "Please make sure that Ms. Wilson has a proper lunch and rest in her quarters today." When they were alone again, Theodore approached Charlotte one last time. "This conversation is not over. Have dinner with me tonight in my office. No uniforms, no titles, just the two of us." Charlotte nodded slightly, watching him adjust his tie and walk towards the door. Before leaving, he stopped, turning partially towards her. "And Charlotte, that night meant everything to me. I just didn't know how to deal with it until now." Alone in the office, Charlotte allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Her hands trembled slightly as she dried her tears. The Montgomery mansion had always been her workplace, its walls keeping a respectful distance between boss and employee. Now, those same walls were witnessing the crumbling of all those carefully constructed barriers and the beginning of something new and frighteningly real. Dinner was served at precisely 8 o'clock in Theodore's office. Mrs. Henderson had prepared grilled salmon with asparagus, wisely ignoring the other employees' curious questions about the unusual arrangement. Charlotte, now dressed in a light blue casual dress, sat in front of Theodore, would exchange his suit for a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. "You look more rested," Theodore commented, pouring water into his glass. Not a drop of wine in sight, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by Charlotte. "The rest helped," she replied, adjusting the napkin on her lap. "Although it was difficult to convince Mrs. Henderson that I didn't need her constant supervision." A small smile appeared on Theodore's lips. "She can be quite protective. As her housekeeper for the last 3 years, I can vouch for that." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of cutlery. Through the office's tall windows, the lights of Boston began to glow against the gradually darkening sky. Charlotte had always admired the view from that room, especially at dusk, when the city seemed to turn into a sea of golden lights. "We need to discuss practical arrangements," Theodore finally said, putting his cutlery aside. "Your position in the house, your health, the baby—" "I can continue working," Charlotte interrupted, her voice firm. "At least for the time being. I don't need any special treatment." "Charlotte," Theodore leaned forward, his green eyes intense. "You're carrying my child. That changes everything." The word son made Charlotte's heart leap. It was the first time he had referred to the baby in that way, making it all the more real. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked, trying to keep her composure. Theodore stood up, walking over to the window. The reflection of the glass showed his tense features, his jaw clenched in concentration. "Marry me?" Charlotte almost dropped her glass. "What? Marry me?" he repeated, turning to face her. "Not just for the baby, but because there's something between us that goes beyond that night at the ball. Something I've been trying to deny for a long time." "Theodore," Charlotte stood up too, her legs shaking slightly. "You can't be serious. The company board, your family—" "To hell with the board," he declared, his voice carrying a conviction she rarely heard. "As for my family, my parents retired to Palm Beach years ago. The only opinion I care about now is yours." Charlotte felt tears begin to form. "People will talk. They'll say I planned all this, that I seduced the rich boss." Theodore crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. "Since when do you care what people say?" The Charlotte I know faces challenges head on. That's how she managed to become head housekeeper at 25. That's how she earned the respect of the whole team. "That's different," she whispered, but didn't remove her hands from his. "Yes, it's different," he agreed, his voice softening. "Because this time you're not alone. I'm here, and I don't intend to go anywhere." The sound of a distant horn in the street momentarily broke the moment. Charlotte looked out of the window, watching the lights of the city she loved so much. Boston had been her home since she left rural Massachusetts at 18, determined to make a life for herself. Now, 10 years later, she was there in Theodore Montgomery's office, carrying her son and listening to a proposal she had never imagined receiving. "I don't expect an answer now," Theodore continued, gently releasing her hands. "But I want you to know that this is not an obligation or a convenient solution. It's what I want, what I've been wanting since before that night at the ball. Charlotte sat down again, feeling the weight of his words. Why did you wait so long to say that? Because I'm a coward when it comes to feelings, he admitted, returning to his seat. I've spent so long building up an image of control and power that I've forgotten what it's like to simply be human. You remind me of that, Charlotte. You always have. Dinner grew cold between them, forgotten amid the intensity of the moment. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the Boston sky, silent witnesses to a conversation that would forever change the course of 2 lives, in fact 3. I need time, Charlotte finally said, her voice firmer, to think, to process all this. All the time you need, Theodore nodded, although his eyes revealed a barely contained anxiety. But please allow me to look after you and the baby in the meantime. Move into the master suite on the 2nd floor. Not as my housekeeper, but as the mother of my child. The proposal was bold, but Charlotte recognized the logic behind it. Her quarters in the staff annex were not ideal for a pregnancy, and the proximity would allow Theodore to be more present during the process. All right, she agreed, surprising them both. But I keep my duties in the house, at least for now. I need that normality. Theodore smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his usually stern face. As you wish, but with conditions. Regular doctor's appointments, proper nutrition, and no excessive exertion. Now you sound exactly like the Theodore Montgomery everyone knows. Always negotiate. The comment drew a laugh from him, a rich, genuine sound that Charlotte realized she would love to hear more often. Dinner continued in a lighter mood, with talk of practical preparations and immediate plans. But beneath the surface of everyday words, a deeper current flowed, the promise of something new, frightening and wonderfully real beginning to take shape. The news of Charlotte's move to the master suite spread to the Montgomery mansion like fire through dry straw. The next morning, as she supervised the transfer of her belongings, she could feel the curious glances and whispers of the other staff. Mrs. Henderson, always loyal, kept the gossips at bay with her imposing presence in the kitchen. Let them talk, said the cook, as she prepared a particularly nutritious breakfast for Charlotte. I've worked in enough wealthy family homes to know that true happiness doesn't follow rules of etiquette. Charlotte smiled gratefully as she watched the older woman meticulously arrange a tray of poached eggs, wholemeal toast, and a selection of fresh fruit. Mrs. Henderson had been her first ally when she had arrived at the Montgomery mansion 3 years ago, and now she was once again proving to be a safe haven amidst the storm of change. Mr. Montgomery called 3 times this morning, Mrs. Henderson continued, an amused twinkle in her eyes. You wanted to make sure you had a proper breakfast before your appointment with Dr. Richardson. The mention of the appointment made Charlotte's stomach turn. Theodore had secured an appointment with Boston's most renowned obstetrician for that morning. Dr. Sarah Richardson worked at Massachusetts General Hospital and had a waiting list of months, but apparently the Montgomery name opened doors that Charlotte didn't even know existed. He's exaggerating, Charlotte sighed, although she couldn't hold back a small smile. Men in love often do that, replied Mrs. Henderson with a meaningful shrug. Before Charlotte could protest, the sound of heels in the hallway announced the arrival of Vanessa Churn, Theodore's personal stylist. The 40-something Asian woman entered the kitchen like a hurricane of energy and determination. Charlotte, darling, Vanessa hugged her as if they were old friends. Theodore told me the news. I've come to do a complete inventory of your closet. We need the right clothes for every stage of pregnancy, and don't tell me that your old dresses fit. Charlotte cast a look of distress at Mrs. Henderson, who just laughed and started to leave the kitchen. Good luck, dear. Miss Chun, when you start a mission, and this is a special mission, Vanessa added, already pulling a tablet from her designer bag. Theodore was very specific about wanting you to have all the best. Besides, I need to match your look to your new position. New position? Charlotte asked, feeling increasingly confused. Why? As the future Mrs. Montgomery, of course. Vanessa replied, as if it were obvious. The social events, the charity meetings, the business dinners. I haven't accepted the request yet, Charlotte interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt. Vanessa stopped her nimble fingers on the tablet and looked at Charlotte with a soft expression. Darling, I've worked with Theodore for 8 years. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Even before the winter formal, It was obvious to anyone with eyes that there was something special there. The sound of a car parking in the driveway interrupted the conversation. Theodore had arrived to take her to her doctor's appointment. Charlotte felt her heart racing, a reaction that seemed to happen with increasing frequency in his presence. "We'll continue this conversation later," Vanessa declared, putting away her tablet. "Now go. You shouldn't keep a man in love waiting, especially when he's Theodore Montgomery." In the foyer, Theodore was waiting for her with an anxious expression barely concealed on his usually impassive face. He was wearing a navy blue suit that highlighted his green eyes, and Charlotte couldn't help noticing how much younger, less stiff he had looked in recent days. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. "Almost," she replied, adjusting her bag. "I just need to give some instructions to the team about—" "Not at all," Theodore interrupted her gently. "The mansion won't collapse in your absence for a few hours. Today you're just Charlotte, mother-to-be, going to her first antenatal appointment." The drive to the hospital was filled with a comfortable silence, only occasionally broken by comments about the traffic or the weather forecast. Boston was looking particularly beautiful that spring morning, with cherry trees starting to bloom along the historic streets. "Vanessa drove through here today," Charlotte commented as they stopped at a traffic light. Theodore smiled, without taking his eyes off the street. "I figured she would. She could be a bit enthusiastic. She's already planning my closet as the future Mrs. Montgomery." The comment made Theodore tense his hands slightly on the steering wheel. "Does that bother you?" Charlotte thought for a moment before answering. "It's not so much the title that worries me, but what it represents. All the exposure, the expectations." "Charlotte," Theodore parked the car at the hospital and turned to her. "I don't want you to be anything other than who you are. It was this strong, independent, and genuine woman that I fell in love with." The statement, said so naturally, made Charlotte hold her breath. It was the first time he had used the word in love, and somehow that made it all the more real. "Let's do this one step at a time," he continued, taking her hand. "Today we're going to meet our baby. The rest we can sort out later." Charlotte nodded, feeling a wave of warmth and security at the touch of his hand. As they walked through the hospital corridors towards Dr. Richardson's office, she realized that, for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she no longer felt alone or scared. The future was still uncertain, but now there was someone by her side, someone who, against all odds, had chosen to break through her own barriers to be with her. Dr. Richardson's office exuded an aura of understated sophistication, with its soft-toned walls and modern furniture. Charlotte sat on the examination table, her fingers unconsciously intertwined with Theodore's, as the doctor applied the gel for the ultrasound. "You're about to hear something very special," Dr. Richardson commented, moving the transducer over Charlotte's abdomen. For a few seconds, only static sound filled the room. Then, like a distant drum, a fast, steady beat emerged from the speakers. "Is that our baby's heart?" Theodore asked, his voice trembling slightly, a vulnerability Charlotte had never imagined witnessing. "Yes, and it's perfectly strong," the doctor smiled, adjusting the image on the screen. 150 beats per minute, exactly as expected for 12 weeks. Charlotte felt tears run down her face as she watched the small shape on the screen, moving gently. Theodore squeezed her hand tighter, and when she looked in his direction, she saw that his eyes were also watering. "Everything indicates a healthy pregnancy," Dr. Richardson continued, making notes on her tablet. "But we need to discuss some necessary changes, Ms. Wilson. Your blood pressure is a little low, and with your recent history of fainting, she'll follow all the recommendations," Theodore interrupted, his tone returning to determined businessman mode. "I've already arranged for a nutritionist who specializes in pregnancy, and—" "Theodore," Charlotte interrupted him gently, "I can answer that for myself." Dr. Richardson smiled, observing the dynamic between the two. "I'll prescribe some supplements and a specific diet. And yes, rest is essential, especially in this first trimester." After the consultation, as they walked down the hospital corridor, Theodore seemed lost in thought. "Sorry if I sound controlling," he said suddenly. "It's just hearing that heart beating, I know," Charlotte replied softly. "It scared me too. Suddenly it's all so real." Before they could reach the elevator, a familiar voice caught Theodore's attention. "Montgomery? What a surprise to find you here. Richard Callahan." a member of the board of Montgomery Real Estate, approached with his wife Patricia. The couple's curious gazes alternated between Theodore and Charlotte, who was still wearing simple clothes that in no way suggested her new position. "Richard, Patricia," Theodore greeted, his posture instantly more formal. Then, to Charlotte's surprise, he wrapped a protective arm around her waist. "I believe you've already met Charlotte Wilson, your housekeeper?" Patricia asked, barely able to disguise the disdain in her voice. "My fiancée," Theodore corrected firmly, "and the mother of my son." The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte could feel the shock emanating from the Callahan couple, but what struck her most was the certainty in Theodore's voice as he introduced her as his fiancée, even without having received his official response. "Well, that's unexpected," Richard finally commented, trying to keep his composure. "I suppose we should expect a formal announcement soon?" "Very soon," Theodore replied, his tone leaving no room for further comment. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have other commitments." In the car, silence hung between them. Charlotte was the first to break it. "You didn't have to do that." "Done what?" "Told the truth." Theodore started the car, but didn't move. "Charlotte, I know you haven't given me an answer yet, but I need you to understand something. I'm not ashamed of how I feel about you or about our son. The Callahans and the rest of Boston society can think whatever they want." "That's easy to say now," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But what about when the rumors start? When people start questioning whether it wasn't all planned, whether I didn't?" Theodore turned off the car and turned fully towards her. "Look at me," he asked softly. When their eyes met, he continued, "That sound we heard today, that heart beating, that's real. What I feel for you is real. Everything else is noise." His words penetrated deep into Charlotte's heart, tearing down another layer of the defenses she had built up over the years. Working class from Massachusetts, she had fought for every achievement in her life, always aware of the social differences that separated her from the world she now inhabited. "I'll send Johnson for your car," Theodore said, finally starting it. "I need to show you something before we go back to the mansion." 20 minutes later, they parked in front of a Victorian house on Beacon Hill, one of Boston's most exclusive areas. The red brick building, with its tall windows and elegant balcony, looked like something out of a postcard. "What are we doing here?" Charlotte asked, as Theodore led her up the steps to the entrance. "This house," he explained, opening the door with a key, "belonged to my grandmother. I grew up spending summers here before she moved to Florida. I've kept the property all these years, but I never knew exactly why. Until now." Charlotte crossed the foyer of the Victorian house, her footsteps echoing softly on the original wooden floor. The interior was surprisingly welcoming, with mahogany paneling on the walls and a curved staircase leading to the second floor. Despite the covered furniture and the dust that accumulated on the surfaces, there was an atmosphere of home that touched her deeply. "My grandmother used to say that this house has soul," Theodore commented, watching Charlotte absorb every detail. "It withstood the Great Fire of 1872, survived wars and economic depressions. It's the kind of place that holds stories. And now you want it to be our home?" Charlotte asked, realizing the intention behind the visit. "If you accept," he replied, leading her into a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows. The Montgomery mansion is imposing, but it's a symbol of the corporate empire. This house has always been about family." As they walked through the rooms, Theodore shared memories. Christmases around the Italian marble fireplace, summer afternoons in the back garden where his grandmother grew prize-winning roses, the stories his grandfather told in the book-lined study. "The master bedroom has an incredible view of the Charles River," he said, climbing the stairs. "And there's a smaller room connected to it that would be perfect for the nursery." The mention of a nursery made Charlotte stop in the middle of the stairs, a wave of excitement overtaking her. Theodore noticed her hesitation and moved back a few steps to stand beside her. "Am I scaring you?" he asked softly. "It's not that," she replied, fighting back tears. "It's just it all seems like a dream. This morning we heard our baby's heartbeat. Now you're showing me a house that could be ours. Sometimes I'm afraid of waking up and discovering that none of this is real." Theodore took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "Charlotte Wilson, You transformed my world from the moment you entered it. For 3 years, I've watched your dedication, your intelligence, your kindness. I fell in love not with the housekeeper of the Montgomery mansion, but with the woman who organizes charity dinners with the same passion as she helps the staff with their personal problems. He paused, his green eyes fixed on hers. At the winter ball, when I finally had the courage to show my feelings, I discovered something even more extraordinary, that you had feelings for me too. And yes, I acted like a coward the next morning, trying to return to the safe professionalism I'd always known. But the universe had other plans for us. Charlotte felt her heart race at his words. Do you really want that? An ordinary life? A family home? Away from the glamour of the mansion? What I want is a life with you, Theodore replied without hesitation. And with our son, the rest is just details. At that moment, a ray of afternoon sun broke through the stained glass windows of the staircase, bathing them in shades of amber and blue. Charlotte looked around, imagining what the house would be like restored to its former glory. Children's laughter echoing through the corridors, family dinners in the elegant dining room, quiet moments in the library. My grandmother's old furniture is in storage, Theodore continued, noticing her interest. But we can decorate it the way you want. Make this our home. Our home, Charlotte whispered, testing the words. Our home, he confirmed, where we could just be Theodore and Charlotte, not the CEO and the housekeeper. Where our son can grow up knowing stories of his great-grandmother and playing in the same garden where I used to play. Arriving on the second floor, Theodore opened the doors to the master bedroom. Even with the furniture covered, you could see the grandeur of the space, with its arched windows and marble fireplace. A side door led to a smaller room, exactly as he had described, perfect for a nursery. The house needs work, he admitted, noticing Charlotte examining an area where the wallpaper was peeling. But we have time. We can restore it little by little, make every room exactly as we dreamed. We? Charlotte asked, turning to him. Theodore approached, placing a hand gently on her cheek. Yes, we. If you accept my request, if you agree to build a life with me, not because you're pregnant, not because I'm Theodore Montgomery, but because, somehow, in the midst of all the social rules and barriers, we've fallen in love with each other. Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand on her face. All the doubts and fears of the last few days seemed to diminish in the face of a certainty she felt at that moment. When she opened her eyes again, she found Theodore looking at her with a mixture of hope and vulnerability that made her heart melt. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Theodore repeated, as if he couldn't believe it. Yes, I agree to marry you. Charlotte smiled for her tears. Yes to this house. Yes to a life together. Yes to everything. The kiss that followed was different from the first one they had shared at the winter ball. That one had been full of repressed desire and impulse. This was a promise, a beginning, the first chapter of a story they were choosing to write together. The news of Theodore Montgomery's engagement to his housekeeper spread through Boston like wildfire. The morning after the visit to the Victorian house, the mansion's phone wouldn't stop ringing, and Theodore's corporate email inbox overflowed with messages of concern from shareholders and business partners. Ignore them, Theodore said firmly over breakfast, which they now shared in the intimacy of his office. The board has scheduled an extraordinary meeting for this afternoon, but it's a mere formality. Montgomery Real Estate is a family business, and I'm the majority shareholder. Charlotte stirred her tea thoughtfully, watching the gardeners go about their business through the window. I don't want to cause any problems for your business, Theodore. You're not causing any problems, he replied, putting the newspaper aside. Actually, I'm looking forward to this meeting. It's about time for some changes in the company, and our relationship has only accelerated the process. At that moment, Martha, Theodore's personal assistant for over a decade, entered the office with a worried expression. Mr. Montgomery, your mother's on the line. It's the third time she's called this morning. Theodore sighed, exchanging a meaningful glance with Charlotte. Put her through, Martha. It's time to face the music. Charlotte tried to get up, but Theodore held her hand, silently asking her to stay. The speakerphone filled the room with Eleanor Montgomery's crystal-clear voice. Theodore James Montgomery, what is this story I'm hearing? Did Patricia Callahan just call and tell me you're going to marry your maid? Good morning to you too, Mom, Theodore replied calmly. And yes, I'm marrying Charlotte Wilson, who happens to be our head housekeeper, not just a maid. She's also pregnant with her first grandchild. The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte squeezed Theodore's hand, feeling her own heart hammering in her chest. Your father and I took the first flight out of Palm Beach, Eleanor finally said. We'll be there in 4 hours. Mom, it's not necessary dash. Don't argue with me, Theodore, Eleanor interrupted him. If you're really going to go through with this madness, we need to talk in person. After hanging up, Theodore wiped his hands across his face in a rare gesture of frustration. I'm sorry about that, he said to Charlotte. My mother can be intense. She has every right to be worried, Charlotte replied softly. It's not every day that the heir to a real estate empire decides to marry the housekeeper. Charlotte, Theodore stood up, pulling her into his arms. You're so much more than that, and my parents will realize that as soon as they get to know you for real. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Vanessa showed up with a selection of clothes she considered appropriate for the first meeting with the Montgomerys, while Mrs. Henderson coordinated an elaborate lunch that might impress Eleanor, known for her demanding palate. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a black limousine parked in the driveway of the mansion. Eleanor Montgomery got out first, her elegant posture and perfectly groomed hair contrasting with her tense expression. George Montgomery, a tall man with gray hair, followed her with more hesitant steps. Theodore and Charlotte were waiting for them in the entrance hall. She was wearing a navy blue midi dress that Vanessa had chosen, feeling strangely out of place in such elegant clothes in the house where she used to work. Mom, Dad, Theodore greeted, his voice firm but gentle. Welcome back to Boston. Eleanor studied Charlotte with critical eyes before speaking. So, this is the woman who turned your life upside down? This is Charlotte Wilson, Theodore corrected, his tone making clear his disapproval of the comment. My fiancée and the woman I love. George Montgomery stepped forward, surprising everyone by extending his hand to Charlotte with a gentle smile. It's a pleasure to officially meet you, my dear. I've always admired how you've kept this house over the last few years. George's unexpected gesture seemed to unsettle Eleanor, who softened her expression slightly. Well, let's at least discuss it civilly over lunch. The meal was served in the formal dining room, a room Charlotte knew well, having overseen countless important dinners there. Now, sitting at the table as part of the family, she observed the dynamic between the Montgomerys with new eyes. How long? Eleanor asked abruptly, between forks of grilled salmon. Excuse me? Charlotte replied, confused. The pregnancy. How long? 12 weeks, Theodore answered for her. And before you asked, Mom, yes, it was planned for us to move to Grandma's house on Beacon Hill. Charlotte has already accepted my proposal. Eleanor put down her cutlery, her eyes fixed on Charlotte. Do you have any idea what you're getting into, young lady? The life Theodore leads, the responsibilities, the expectations of society. With all due respect, Mrs. Montgomery, Charlotte replied, finding strength she didn't know she had. I've spent the last 3 years observing and participating in that life. I know exactly how your world works, but I also know that your son is more than just the CEO of Montgomery Real Estate. He's a man who deserves to be loved for who he is, not for what he has. A heavy silence fell over the table. George snorted, hiding a small smile behind his wine glass. Eleanor looked at her husband, then at her son, and finally back at Charlotte. Well, she said at last, at least you have courage. You'll need it. Eleanor Montgomery's comment about courage echoed in the dining room like a reluctant acknowledgement. Charlotte noticed a slight change in the matriarch's posture. Not exactly approval, but something close to cautious respect. I intend to make an official announcement at the board meeting this afternoon, Theodore informed her, pouring himself some more water. Charlotte and I have decided that transparency is the best approach. What about the legal aspect? George Montgomery asked, his calm voice contrasting with his earlier tension. I imagine a prenuptial agreement would be prudent. There will be no prenuptial agreement, Theodore replied firmly, eliciting an audible choke from his mother. Charlotte is not interested in family money, and I trust her completely. Eleanor put her napkin down on the table with more force than necessary. Theodore, be reasonable. You have responsibilities to the company, to the family legacy. And that's exactly why Charlotte is perfect, Theodore argued, his hand finding hers under the table. She understands management, about keeping a house running smoothly, about leading a team. Most importantly, she understands me. A reflective silence fell over the table. Mrs. Henderson entered discreetly to serve dessert, a chocolate souffle that was a house specialty. Charlotte noticed how the cook cast a supportive glance in her direction before withdrawing. You were always stubborn, Eleanor sighed, tasting the souffle. Just like a grandfather. He didn't care about social conventions when he decided something either. That's why you fell in love with him, isn't it? George commented with a nostalgic smile. A Montgomery rarely follows the expected path when the heart is involved. Charlotte observed an exchange of glances between the older couple, realizing for the first time that perhaps her own history with Theodore wasn't as unprecedented as it seemed. The house on Beacon Hill, Eleanor said suddenly. Do you intend to restore it? Yes, Charlotte replied, sensing an opportunity to connect. Theodore showed it to me yesterday. It's a special place. I spent my childhood in that house, Eleanor revealed, her tone softening. Every room has a story. The wallpaper in the master bedroom, for example, was chosen by my mother on a trip to Paris. We like to keep the essence of the house, Charlotte said. Perhaps you could help us with that? Share memories. Suggest details we shouldn't lose in the restoration. The invitation seemed to take Eleanor by surprise. She studied Charlotte for a moment, as if seeing her truly for the first time. It would be appropriate, she finally replied. That house deserves to be a home again. Theodore watched the interaction with a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. His cell phone vibrated, reminding him of the upcoming board meeting. I need to get ready for the meeting, he announced, standing up. Charlotte, do you want to accompany me? Actually, Eleanor interrupted. If you don't mind, Theodore, I'd like to show Charlotte some old photos of the house. I have some albums in a car that I brought just for that. The request surprised everyone. Theodore looked at Charlotte, who nodded slightly. Of course, he agreed, leaning over to kiss Charlotte's forehead. I'll be in the office if you need me. When Theodore and George left to prepare for the meeting, Eleanor led Charlotte into the living room. From the trunk of her limousine, the chauffeur brought 3 leather-bound photo albums. This one's from 1962, Eleanor explained, opening the first album. The year my parents bought the house. Look how different the garden was. The next 2 hours were filled with stories about debutante parties, Thanksgiving dinners, and lazy summers in the back garden. Charlotte realized that each photo, each memory shared, was a small bridge being built between her and her future mother-in-law. Theodore was always different from the other boys, Eleanor commented, pausing on a photo of her son at the age of 10, sitting on the stairs of the house with a book in his lap. More intense, more determined. When he decided something, there was no changing his mind. Some things never change, Charlotte smiled. No, they don't, Eleanor agreed, closing the album. And maybe that's why you're exactly what he needs. Someone strong enough to stand up to that stubborn Montgomery. The sound of voices coming from the hall announced the arrival of the board members for the meeting. Charlotte recognized Richard Callahan among them, his expression still clearly disapproving. It won't be easy, Eleanor warned, watching the movement. But nothing worthwhile usually is. I'm not afraid of hard work, Charlotte replied. Or of challenges. No, Eleanor smiled slightly. I imagine you're not. The Montgomery real estate boardroom was full when Theodore entered, Charlotte at his side. The 12 board members, seated around the solid mahogany table, exchanged tense glances. Richard Callahan huffed uncomfortably, adjusting his Italian tie. Ladies and gentlemen, Theodore began, his voice commanding immediate attention. I have called this extraordinary meeting to make 2 important announcements that will affect the future of this company. Charlotte stood near the door, observing the dynamics of the room. She knew every face present. She had served coffee and organized lunches for all of them at some point in the last 3 years. Now, those same faces stared at her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. First, Theodore continued, Charlotte Wilson and I are engaged. Secondly, we're expecting our first child. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a pen falling on the table. Patricia Morrison, the only woman on the board apart from Eleanor Montgomery, was the first to speak up. "Theodore, surely you understand our concern," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Montgomery Real Estate has a centuries-old reputation, and will continue to do so," Theodore replied firmly. "Which brings me to the third announcement. I'm restructuring the company. As of today, we will be establishing a new division focused on social housing and the revitalization of historic neighborhoods." This statement caused more of a stirrer than the engagement announcement. Richard Callahan stood up abruptly. "That's absurd. Our investors, they've already approved the project," Theodore interrupted him. "Actually, it was Charlotte who inspired me to take this step. Her previous work with community organizations in South End made me realize an opportunity we were missing." Charlotte held her breath. Theodore had never mentioned that he knew about her voluntary work in her spare time. She coordinated a project that helped low-income families find decent housing, something she kept separate from her professional life at the mansion. "And who's going to head up this new division?" asked James Morton, one of the older counselors. "Charlotte," Theodore replied without hesitation. "Her management experience, combined with her knowledge of the real needs of the community, makes her the ideal person." The room erupted in protests. Charlotte stepped forward, her clear voice cutting through the tumult. "Gentlemen, ladies, I understand your concerns. But before you judge me by my current position, allow me to present my vision for this project." With a confidence she didn't know she possessed, Charlotte detailed her plan to revitalize abandoned historic buildings, turning them into affordable housing without losing their architectural value. She talked about partnerships with local organizations, about job training programs for residents, about how this could not only benefit the community, but also generate sustainable financial returns. Eleanor Montgomery, who had quietly entered during the presentation, watched with growing interest. When Charlotte had finished, the matriarch said, "I support the project, and I suggest we start with the old textile mill in Dorchester." Eleanor's unexpected support completely changed the dynamic of the meeting. One by one, the council members began to see merit in the proposal. Even Richard Callahan, still visibly uncomfortable, had to admit that the figures made sense. "There's one more thing," Theodore added when the initial tension had subsided. "Charlotte and I will be moving into my grandmother's house on Beacon Hill. The mansion will be transformed into a cultural and educational center in partnership with the Social Housing Project." This news seemed to finally break down the last holdouts. The idea of keeping the Montgomery mansion as a public legacy, rather than selling it or keeping it empty, pleased even the most conservative members of the council. When the meeting ended 2 hours later, the initial plans were already in motion. Charlotte found herself surrounded by counselors keen to discuss details of the project, her former duties as housekeeper completely forgotten in the face of her new position. "You were brilliant," Theodore whispered in her ear when they were finally alone in the room. "I always knew there was much more to you than everyone saw." "Did you know about my work in the South End?" she asked, still processing everything that had happened. "Charlotte, I noticed you from the first day you joined his company. I saw how you organized discreet donations of old furniture for families in need, how you advise employees on housing programs, how you transformed the mansion into a more humane place." Tears threatened to fall, but Charlotte held them back. In the hallway, they could hear the excited voices of the advisors discussing the new projects. A new era was beginning, not just for them as a couple, but for the entire Montgomery empire. "Are you ready for this?" Theodore asked, his hands finding hers. "To build something meaningful alongside you?" Charlotte smiled. "I always have been." The news of Montgomery Real Estate's restructuring and Theodore's engagement to Charlotte went viral in Boston business circles. The Boston Globe devoted a front-page story to what it called the new face of the Montgomery Empire, especially highlighting the social housing project. Charlotte discovered that her life had changed completely in a matter of days. Her mornings, once taken up with running the mansion, were now filled with planning meetings and visits to possible sites for the project. Theodore had insisted that she keep Mrs. Henderson as her personal assistant, a decision that brought tears to the former cook's eyes. "I never doubted you, dear," Mrs. Henderson said as they organized the move to Beacon Hill. "From day one, I saw something special in your eyes. That quiet determination, you know. The Victorian house was gradually coming to life. Eleanor Montgomery, surprising everyone, had become a constant presence during the restoration, sharing stories about each room while the architects and decorators worked. This wallpaper, Eleanor explained, gently touching the wall of what would be the baby's room, was brought from London in 1889. Your great-grandmother insisted on keeping it when they bought the house. She said it brought luck to the babies who slept here. Charlotte smiled, looking at the delicate floral patterns which, miraculously, still retain their beauty after so many decades. It's perfect. We can restore it rather than replace it. You understand, Eleanor nodded approvingly. You understand that it's not just a house, but a legacy. The transformation wasn't just limited to the physical spaces. Charlotte herself felt herself changing, growing into her new position. The nauseous mornings were gradually replaced by renewed energy, and her body was beginning to show the first visible signs of pregnancy. Theodore, always attentive, insisted on accompanying her to every doctor's appointment, even when it meant rearranging important meetings. During one of these checkups, Dr. Richardson surprised them with some unexpected news. "Well, it looks like we have a little surprise here," the doctor smiled, adjusting the ultrasound monitor. "See these two shapes? Congratulations, you're expecting twins." The silence that followed was broken by the soft sound of the heartbeat, now double, filling the room. Charlotte felt Theodore's hand squeeze hers, and when she looked up at him, she saw unshed tears in his eyes. "Two," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Two babies, two little Montgomery boys," Dr. Richardson confirmed. "They both look perfectly healthy." The news of the twins brought a new dimension to their plans. What had once been one baby's room would now need to accommodate two, and the preparations for the baby's arrival took on an even greater sense of urgency. "My mother is going to be ecstatic," Theodore commented as they drove home. "She's always wanted twins in the family." "Your mother has surprised me," Charlotte admitted. "She's been incredibly supportive with the restoration of the house and the company projects." "You've won her over," Theodore smiled. "Not that it surprises me. You have this gift of seeing beyond appearances, of finding the best in people." The social housing project was progressing rapidly. The old textile mill in Dorchester, suggested by Eleanor, turned out to be perfect for the first development. The plans included not only affordable apartments, but also a vocational training center and a community nursery. "I thought we'd call it the Montgomery Community Center," Charlotte suggested during a meeting with the development team. "It would be a way to honor the family's history as we build their new chapter." The suggestion was enthusiastically received, especially by Eleanor, who saw it as a perfect bridge between the family's past and future. Even the most conservative members of the board were beginning to see the value of the new direction the company was taking. In the evenings, in the quiet of the house on Beacon Hill, Charlotte often found Theodore in his restored office, working on plans and projects. On one such evening, he surprised her with a special discovery. "I found this today," he said, showing her an old diary. "It belonged to my grandmother. Apparently, she also faced resistance when she decided to marry my grandfather. He was a university professor at the time, not exactly what society expected for the heiress to a real estate fortune." Charlotte flipped through the yellowed pages, absorbing the words written in faded blue ink. "How they get through it? With love and determination," Theodore replied, hugging her from behind. "Just like we're doing." There was something deeply symbolic about being there, in the same house where generations of Montgomerys had lived out their stories of love and overcoming. The old walls seemed to hold not only memories, but also wisdom, as if silently approving the new chapter that was being written. "The babies will love growing up here," Charlotte murmured, her hands resting on the small bulge of her belly. "Surrounded by so much love and history, and by parents who aren't afraid to break the rules when necessary," Theodore added, kissing her neck softly, "or to build new paths when the old ones no longer fit." A yellowed envelope, discovered during the restoration of a wooden panel in the study of the Beacon Hill house, would change Charlotte's perspective on the Montgomery legacy. Inside, letters dated 1925 revealed a story that seemed to echo her own journey. "I found something you need to see," Theodore called out to Charlotte one Saturday afternoon as they supervised the restoration. His fingers gently held the age of letters. It's correspondence between my great-grandmother, Margaret Montgomery, and a housekeeper called Rose Sullivan. Charlotte sat down next to him on the newly restored Victorian sofa, curious. The letters revealed that Rose had been much more than just a servant. She had been Margaret's confidant during a turbulent period in the family's history, when the Great Depression threatened the Montgomery Empire. "Dear Rose," Theodore read aloud, "your suggestion to turn part of our properties into affordable housing for families affected by the crisis was not only brilliant, but it saved our company. Arthur finally recognized that sometimes we need to look beyond immediate profit to build something truly lasting. So I'm not the first to suggest changes in the company's direction," Charlotte commented, stroking her already visible 5-month belly. "Not only that," Theodore continued, picking up another letter, "Rose ended up marrying Robert Montgomery, Arthur's younger brother. The family tried to keep this story quiet at the time, but according to these letters, it was this marriage that brought a new perspective to the family business." The discovery of the letters coincided with a series of significant changes to the Dorchester project. Excavations for the foundation of the Montgomery Community Center had uncovered historical artifacts from the former working-class community, including photographs and documents from the time when the factory was in full operation. "We could incorporate this history into the project," Charlotte suggested during a meeting with the team of architects. "Create a small museum that tells the story of the workers, showing how the site is transforming but retaining its community essence." Eleanor, who was now taking an active part in the meetings, nodded approvingly. Rose would have loved that idea. She always said that buildings have a soul, that they carry the stories of the people who have passed through them. Eleanor's involvement in the project had come as a pleasant surprise to everyone. The Montgomery matriarch, once known for her rigidity with traditions, was now regularly seen talking to local residents, collecting stories and suggestions for the community center. "You've changed my mother," Theodore remarked one evening, as they sorted through the found letters. "Actually, you changed the whole Montgomery family." Charlotte smiled, remembering how different things were just a few months ago. "It wasn't me, Theodore. It was your family's own history that showed us the way. Rose and Margaret had planted those seeds a long time ago." A strong kick from one of the babies made her pause, putting her hand over the spot. Theodore immediately put his hand over hers, amazed as always at his children's movements. "They'll grow up knowing all this history," he said softly. "Not just the official Montgomery version, but also the stories of people like Rose, who helped shape who we are today." The restoration work on the house continued to reveal new secrets. In a built-in cupboard in the master bedroom, they found a diary by Robert Montgomery, detailing his struggle to be accepted after his marriage to Rose. His words seemed to echo through time. The true value of a family is not in its name or fortune, but in its ability to grow and adapt without losing its essence. As autumn approached Boston, bringing with it an explosion of color in the trees of Beacon Hill, the preparations for the wedding began to take shape. At Charlotte's suggestion, the ceremony would be held in the garden of the house, with the restored facade as a backdrop. Rose and Robert also got married here, Eleanor revealed, showing an old photograph she had found. It was a small ceremony, but Margaret made sure it was in the garden. She said that outdoor weddings brought good luck. The project in Dorchester was progressing rapidly. The old factory was gradually being transformed into a modern complex that retained elements of its original architecture. The first families had already been selected for the apartments, and the vocational training center was about to start its activities. "We found some more letters," Mrs. Hennison reported one day, handing over a new set of documents discovered while cleaning out the mansion's attic. "It seems that Rose maintained correspondence with several families who lived on the Montgomery estates during the Depression. The letters revealed a network of mutual support that had formed during those difficult years. Families helping families, sharing resources and knowledge. It was exactly the kind of community Charlotte hoped to recreate with the new project. "It's as if the past is guiding us," she commented to Theodore as they organized their new discoveries. "Every letter, every story we find, confirms that we're on the right track." Autumn was painting Beacon Hill in golden hues when Charlotte found the last set of letters, hidden in an old music box in the attic. Unlike the other correspondence, these were more personal, exchanged between Rose and her younger sister, Mary Sullivan, revealing intimate details about her integration into the Montgomery family. "Dear Mary," Charlotte read aloud to Theodore, sitting in the restored study. "Today Margaret defended me before the Boston Ladies' Club. When Mrs. Astor insinuated that my marriage to Robert was inappropriate, Margaret simply replied that true nobility lies in one's actions, not one's surname. I've never felt more accepted as part of this family." Theodore watched Charlotte read, noticing how her expression changed with every word. At 6 months pregnant, she radiated a serene beauty, her hands occasionally resting on the prominent belly where her twins were growing. "I found something else," she continued, taking a yellowed newspaper clipping out of the box. An article from the Boston Herald from 1926. Apparently, Rose established one of the first night schools for factory workers on the premises of Montgomery Real Estate itself. "History repeats itself," Theodore smiled, picking up the clipping. "Like our vocational training center in Dorchester. The Montgomery Community Center project was transforming not only the neighborhood, but the very perception of the company in the city." The Boston Business Journal had published an extensive article on the initiative, highlighting how a century-old company was reinventing itself for the new times without losing its essence. Eleanor Montgomery had become a constant presence at planning meetings, bringing with her a unique perspective that blended tradition and innovation. At one of these meetings, she surprised everyone with an unexpected suggestion. "We should name the center's library after Rose Sullivan Montgomery," she proposed. After all, it was she who first understood that education and decent housing go hand in hand. The suggestion was unanimously approved, and Charlotte felt an even deeper connection with the woman who, almost a century earlier, had faced challenges similar to her own. The newly discovered letters revealed that Rose had also faced a difficult pregnancy during her first year of marriage. "The doctors recommend rest," Charlotte read in another letter. "But how can I rest when there is so much work to be done? Robert and Margaret insist that the baby's health comes first, but every family we help is like a child to me too." "That reminds me of someone," Theodore commented, casting a meaningful glance at Charlotte, who had attended 3 meetings that day, despite Dr. Richardson's recommendations to reduce her activities. The restoration of the house was almost complete, each room revealing new stories as it was restored. The twins' bedroom, with its carefully restored vintage wallpaper, had become a symbol of the union between past and present. Rose gave birth to twins too, Eleanor revealed over afternoon tea in the restored garden. 2 boys. One of them was my father. This revelation brought a new dimension to the connection Charlotte felt with Rose. The coincidences seemed more than mere chance. It was as if an invisible thread connected their stories across the decades. The wedding was scheduled for late fall, when the last golden leaves would still adorn the garden. Charlotte had chosen a dress that paid homage to the style of the 1920s, with details reminiscent of Rose's wedding dress seen in old photographs. "We found something else you should see," Mrs. Hennison said one afternoon, bringing out a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate pearl necklace with a note: "To the next Montgomery bride who dares to follow her heart. Love, Rose." The tears came easily, a combination of pregnancy hormones and genuine emotion. The necklace had been passed down through generations of Montgomery brides, but had been lost over the last few decades. Its reappearance seemed more like a sign of approval of the past. "It's as if she knows," Charlotte whispered, touching the pearl softly, as if she somehow knew that one day someone would follow in her footsteps. The impact of the discoveries on Rose went beyond the personal. Each new letter, each document found, helped build a richer narrative for the community center. The stories of the families Rose had helped during the Great Depression served as inspiration for the social programs they were developing. "Let's create a digital archive," Charlotte suggested during a board meeting. "Preserve these stories not only as part of the Montgomery legacy, but as a reminder that companies can and should play an active social role." The suggestion was enthusiastically received, especially by Richard Callahan, who had become an unlikely ally after learning more about Rose's story. My own grandmother was one of the people Rose helped, he revealed. I never made the connection until I saw the letters. As autumn progressed and the wedding date drew closer, Charlotte spent more and more time organizing the letters and documents she found. Each story uncovered was like a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing not only the Montgomery family's past, but also a blueprint for their future. Dr. Richardson's office was unusually quiet that October morning when Charlotte and Theodore arrived for another checkup on the twins. At 7 months pregnant, Charlotte carried her belly with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The babies were proving to be as determined as their parents, making their presence known with constant kicks and movements. The babies are in perfect position, Dr. Richardson smiled, adjusting the ultrasound monitor. And look, it seems we can finally determine the sex with certainty. Theodore squeezed Charlotte's hand, holding his breath. At previous appointments, the twins had been shy, never allowing a clear view. A boy and a girl, the doctor announced, pointing to the screen. Perfectly healthy. The news brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. The night before, she had dreamt of Rose Sullivan Montgomery after spending hours reading her letters. In the dream, Rose was smiling, holding 2 babies, one in each arm. It's as if she knew, Charlotte whispered to Theodore as they left the office. Rose also had twins of different sexes. The coincidence didn't go unnoticed by Eleanor when she received the news. The Montgomery matriarch was overseeing the final details of the restoration of the house's library, where the family's letters and historical documents would be preserved. Rose always said that twins brought balance, Eleanor commented, showing an old photograph of Rose's children playing in a garden, one carrying the strength of the other, like yin and yang. The Montgomery Community Center in Dorchester was close to opening. The first families had already started moving in, and the Vocational Training Center had begun a pilot program with 20 students. Among them was Maria Rodriguez, a young solo mother who was very reminiscent of the stories of the women Rose had helped decades ago. I found some more letters, Mrs. Henderson announced over breakfast, bringing out a yellowed envelope discovered behind a panel in the basement of the mansion. This one is different from the others. It's a letter that Rose never sent. Charlotte opened the envelope carefully, feeling the weight of the story in her hands. The letter, dated 1960, was addressed to the future members of the Montgomery family. To those who will come after me, when I married Robert Montgomery, many said that I was destroying a dynasty, that a simple employee couldn't possibly understand the weight of a century-old legacy. But what they didn't understand was that legacies aren't just built with bricks and mortar, but with compassion and vision. Every life we touch, every family we help find a home, every child we educate, these are the true foundations of the Montgomery Empire. Robert and Margaret understood this, and together we built something greater than our social differences. To anyone who finds this letter, keep building bridges instead of walls. True power lies not in how much you own, but in how much you can share. With love and hope, Rose Sullivan Montgomery. Rose's words seemed to pass through time, speaking directly to Charlotte's heart. The work at the community center wasn't just a business project. It was the continuation of a legacy of compassion and social vision that Rose had started. Let's name our daughter Rose, Charlotte decided that evening, as she and Theodore organized the twins' room. And the boy can be named Robert, after the man who had the courage to follow his heart. Theodore smiled, putting the last piece of the crib in place. Rose and Robert Montgomery, the next generation carrying on the legacy of love and change. The wedding was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The garden of the Beacon Hill house was already showing signs of preparations, with marquees being erected and lights being installed in the century-old trees. Charlotte had insisted on an intimate ceremony with just family and close friends. Rose had a small wedding here too, Eleanor commented, helping with the arrangements. She said it wasn't the party that was important, but the meaning behind it. As the big day approached, more discoveries about Rose emerged. A diary found in the attic revealed her innermost thoughts about pregnancy, motherhood, and the challenge of balancing family with social responsibility. Her words echoed Charlotte's own experiences. "It's like she's guiding me," Charlotte confided to Mrs. Henderson as they sorted through the latest batch of discovered documents. Every letter, every page of the diary, seems to contain exactly the message I need to hear. Rose Sullivan Montgomery's story had become more than a historical record. It was a beacon guiding the future of the family and the company. Her legacy of compassion and social vision was being renewed through Charlotte and Theodore, proving that some stories are worth repeating. The wedding day dawned with a golden light typical of the Boston fall, filtering through the restored windows of the house on Beacon Hill. Charlotte, in a room on the second floor, watched the preparations in the garden as Mrs. Henderson adjusted the last details of her vintage dress. "Something old," Eleanor said, entering the room with Rose's pearl necklace in her hands. "Something new," she continued, revealing a small sapphire brooch. "It was my mother's, and now it's yours." Tears threatened to ruin her carefully applied makeup, but Charlotte held them back. Her 7-month belly, far from being an impediment, only added a special aura to the 1920s inspired dress. The twins, as if sensing the importance of the moment, moved gently. "We found something else this morning," Eleanor continued, pulling an envelope from her pocket. It was hidden inside the frame of the front door, with instructions to be opened on the wedding day of the next Montgomery bride who dared to change the rules. Rose's elegant handwriting filled the yellowed paper. "Dear bride, if you are reading this letter, it means that, like me, you have found your way into this family not through social conventions, but through true love. The garden where you will be married today has witnessed many Montgomery love stories, each unique in its own way. When I married Robert here, the fall flowers decorated the beds just as they do today. Margaret had insisted on holding the wedding in the garden, saying that it was where the heart of the house really beat. She was right. Carry with you the certainty that this place, this family, has room for all kinds of love. The Montgomerys may seem rigid at first glance, but their true legacy is built on open hearts and minds willing to evolve. With love, Rose Sullivan Montgomery, the sound of soft music began to drift through the air. It was time. George Montgomery knocked softly on the door, offering his arm to lead Charlotte into the garden. On the way, they passed the newly restored library, where the family's letters and documents were now carefully preserved, telling stories of love, courage, and transformation through the generations. The garden was magnificent. Vintage lanterns hung from the centuries-old trees, their lights still dim in the daylight. Flowers in shades of copper and gold decorated the path to the makeshift altar, where Theodore waited, his gaze conveying all the love and certainty that words could not express. Among the guests, Charlotte recognized familiar faces from the Montgomery Community Center. Maria Rodriguez, now coordinator of the vocational training program, was smiling with tears in her eyes. Richard Callahan, who had become one of the biggest advocates of the company's social project, was sitting next to his wife, his previous expression of disapproval completely transformed. When Charlotte reached the altar, Theodore took her hands in his green eyes shining with restrained emotion. The celebrant began the ceremony by talking about how some loves transcend time and circumstance, echoing through generations. Just as Rose and Robert Montgomery proved almost a century ago, he said, true love knows no social barriers or conventions. It simply is. Vows were exchanged with voices choked with emotion. Theodore spoke of how Charlotte had transformed not only his life, but the entire Montgomery legacy, bringing back the spirit of compassion and social vision that Rose had planted. Charlotte, for her part, talked about finding not just a love, but a mission to continue the work started by a brave woman who had dared to dream of a fairer world. When the rings were exchanged, a ray of sunshine broke through the clouds, illuminating the restored stained glass window of the house that served as the backdrop for the ceremony. It was as if the universe itself had blessed the union. The reception that followed was a celebration not only of the love between Charlotte and Theodore, but of all the positive changes their union had brought about. The Montgomery Community Center was flourishing, with more than 50 families already benefiting and plans to expand to other neighborhoods in Boston. As they danced their first waltz as husband and wife, Theodore whispered in Charlotte's ear, Rose and Robert would be proud, not just of the community center, but of how its history has inspired a new generation. Charlotte smiled, feeling the babies move gently, They'll grow up knowing all these stories. Rose and Robert Montgomery, too, will be reminded of the true meaning of the name they bear. The party continued into the night, the vintage lanterns now lit, creating a magical atmosphere in the historic garden. Eleanor Montgomery, watching the happy couple, commented to Mrs. Hinnison, "Some stories deserve to be retold. Some traditions deserve to be broken so that new ones can be born." Later, when most of the guests had left, Charlotte and Theodore went upstairs to the library. There, among the letters and memories preserved from past generations, they began to write in a new diary, the first record of the next chapter in the Montgomery story. "To our children and their children," Charlotte wrote on the first page, "may they always remember that the true legacy of a family is not in its name or fortune, but in the love it shares and the lives it touches." Theodore added, "And may they carry with them Rose's courage, Robert's vision, and the certainty that some love stories are destined to change the world, one life at a time."